Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you listening in the States. My name is Penny Hayes, and I am the CEO of the Trust Bridge, and I'm here today with my colleagues, David Clark, who is one of the subject matter experts in the area of cybersecurity and data protection and regulation. We've been running a series of webinars with a number of alliance partners, and we've been looking at topical issues such as data protection, cybersecurity, and remote working. More recently, we've been looking at things like COVID-19 and the tracking devices. But today, we're going to be looking at the recent judgment by the EU court, which is commonly known as the Schrems July, and all of the implications that that has for various organisations across the UK, the US, and the EU. It's caused a lot of discussion. So we're delighted to welcome Malcolm Dowden from Womble Bond Dickinson today, and Jonathan Bowker from Innovation Integrations today to lead our discussion together with David. So David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Penny. Just checking. Yeah, I think my camera's muted as well. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Yeah, David Clark. Yeah, I've got a background in cybersecurity and data protection, working with many of the FTSE 200 companies. And especially in the last 5-6 years, I've been working a lot in the data protection arena.
Thank you, David. And Malcolm, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm a legal director at Womble Bond Dickinson, which is a transatlantic law firm. So we obviously have clients who are affected on both sides of the pond by the Schrems judgment over the last couple of weeks.
And Jonathan, welcome, Jonathan. You've been working together with Malcolm on some technology-driven legal services recently and a concept called Lawyer in the Loop. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you, Penny. Yes, so I'm Jonathan Bowker. I'm CEO of Innovative Integrations. I've been working closely with Malcolm now for about 12 months to understand how artificial intelligence and machine learning can be embedded in legal process. So the Lawyer in the Loop concept is to actually invite lawyers or legal practitioners into the process or data processing. And the underpinning it is a framework for natural language processing that we've developed, which is called ETHL, which stands for Extract, Transform, Hash, Encrypt, and Load. And it's an automation platform.
Great, that's really, really interesting. So before we start any discussion, I'd really like to ask all of the participants to use the chat function on the system, and I'll be monitoring those questions and be asking our panel. So Malcolm, clearly the judgment by the EU court known as Schrems July has caused a lot of chatter amongst data professionals. Why is it significant for international data transfer?
Well, it's significant for two main reasons, and those are the two components of the judgment. The first, which I guess is the headline, is that the European Court struck down the EU-US Privacy Shield arrangement. And that was a very limited form of adequacy arrangement that allowed the transfer of personal data from the US and the UK into the United States if the recipient had essentially self-certified and signed up to the Privacy Shield principles. So that has been struck down. And crucially, the reason it was struck down was that US federal government digital surveillance essentially meant that personal data being transferred into the US could be accessed by the federal government in a way that is inconsistent with data subject rights. So that's the first big headline. Privacy Shield has gone. The second aspect of the judgment relates to standard contract clauses or model clauses. And that's one of the fallback mechanisms that legitimizes the transfer of personal data. The first question we always ask is, are we transferring personal data to a jurisdiction that is recognized as giving adequate protection to data subjects? If we're not, then we have to look for either standard contract clauses as the legitimizing mechanism, or if it's a transfer within a corporate group, then we look for binding corporate rules that have been approved by a regulator. Now, the Schrems judgment said that standard contract clauses are potentially still valid, but we need, if we're using them, to verify that data will be protected and that those clauses will be meaningful in the jurisdiction to which we transfer data. Now, that aspect is relevant to EU and UK to US transfers, but it also applies to every other jurisdiction for which there isn't an adequacy decision. So that's around about 180 jurisdictions worldwide, where if we're using standard contract clauses, we also have to take the additional step of verification. But as I think Jonathan will tell us during the course of this webinar, that verification can be enormously helped if we really pay close attention to data pseudonymization or depersonalization.
So is it really just an adequacy play, and will it go away?
It won't go away. The criteria for making an adequacy decision are essentially set out in GDPR. So it's the procedure under the GDPR Article 45. The Commission has to really investigate how personal data will be protected and the extent to which it can be protected in a receiving jurisdiction. I honestly don't see the US government moving away from its surveillance agenda. I honestly don't see the US government wanting to be seen, in fact, to yield to what many of my American colleagues are thinking of as a huge judicial overreach by the European Court. So I think from a legal perspective, we have a truly difficult position. But very often, when you come up against an intractable legal problem, there is a technology-based or a practical way around it. And I think that's where we really need to focus our efforts.
So, David, how do you see this affecting various organisations sending? Well, first of all, the question, do they know where their data is going in many cases?
Yeah, I think that's probably kind of key to it. And most of this has to be a form of preparation because we don't really know what's coming down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, obviously the fundamentals, knowing where your data is, how it's used, is there an international transfer, or a transfer where it's internationally resident is probably kind of more correct, really, because I think if you look at the transport layers, they go all over the world before they get to where they're going anyway. So yeah, I think in an ideal scenario, if it was possible, and it is in some cases to do this, to put a layer of control over that, and that could be technology, as Malcolm says, more sophisticated layers of encryption that are controlled by I guess the controller, maybe, because I think it's very hard to say who actually finally controls the encryption. Normally the provider has the keys as well in many cases, and it gets very complicated if you try and manage them yourself. So that potentially could be the direction where things need to go from a technology point of view. I guess we kind of got the other little difficulty is the ICO guidance says do a risk assessment on the SECs. I'm not sure how you do that because you can't actually change them. So that's one thing. And the other thing is most government departments are using US technology. So by the mere fact we're talking to them, we're already transferring our data to the US. And how are they dealing with it?
So how do we go about figuring that all out, where the data is flowing from one place to another? Maybe that's a question for Jonathan.
Yes, thank you, Penny. Well, there are I think there are several ways you can do it, but the most common way is to, or the simplest way would be to have a look at your firewall and examine the traffic that's crossing your firewall. And there are a number of different technologies you can use. You can put network taps on, or you could put a proxy, which would just act as a gateway on the outside of your firewall. and you can then track the packets of data that are being sent. So there's be an IP address from the server or the laptop or the sending application to the IP address externally, and those IP addresses externally can then be enriched on the way through with geographical data and the type of device that's actually receiving it. So that way you can create a sort of a geolocational map, so you can see the actual flows, where data is going from to. So you have an idea. At least you then have an idea of the traffic crossing your firewalls. But also, it gives you deeper analytics into the type of protocols that are being used. So that will allow you to understand if data is in fact likely to be personal data. And in order to sort of supplement that, we would normally recommend that you perform a data registration exercise by crawling your databases to understand and profile the databases and all of the personal data that you have in them, so that you can attach that information to the IP address that you're sending it from, so you can automatically see or join together the data to understand actually something is leaving from that IP address. We do know, and we have got a personal data register and records of processing activity against that, so you can then link all of that information automatically to then decide whether or not you need to take any further action.
Okay. No, the interesting thought there, and we've had this conversation, Malcolm, David, and I in the past, that even if we discover that there is data flowing from here to the US, surely some of our standard clauses are relevant for this. And we've actually had a question already on that particular subject, suggesting that where standard clauses are relied on in a transfer mechanism, data controllers should verify that the data will be protected, and the importer is capable of complying with those standard clauses. So, Malcolm, what does that look like in practice?
I think what it's going to look like is really two elements. The first is that we're verifying that the clauses will be treated as meaningful in the receiving jurisdiction by essentially seeking an opinion from local lawyers to that effect. And in the US, we're really at the point where we're having to think about taking a state-by-state legal opinion. The campaigner, Max Schrems, immediately after the judgment was handed down, advanced the view that the standard contract clauses simply couldn't be used because no US lawyer would be able to give that verification because of federal government surveillance. So that brings me on to the second part of what I think we need to do. The European Data Protection Board issued a series of responses in the form of FAQs to the Schrems judgment. And what they're suggesting is that you seek a legal opinion on the basis of the clauses, plus looking at any supplemental measures or further safeguards that you can put in place. And I think that's moving us towards the discussion about anonymization or pseudonymization of data. Now, at this stage, let me say I don't believe there is such a thing as anonymization. I think it's rather like the comment in Father Ted about priests' black socks. They're hardly ever black. They're very, 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 very dark blue. And I think very, 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 very dark blue means strongly pseudonymized, which I think is about as far as we can go. So it's a combination of legal opinions based on the clauses, supplemented by a legal opinion about the extent of protection afforded by pseudonymization of data, and that requires lawyers to be working together really closely with data specialists.
That is an area I know that you and Jonathan have been working on, and Jonathan has sent me a slide here to show, if I can just bring that one up, Oh, sorry, that's not the right one. There we go. Maybe you'd like to talk through this in a bit more detail, because I think this is probably one of the practical solutions that maybe we can offer to people at this point in time.
Yes, so the idea is, from the left-hand side, is data, human readable personal data that is stored in a database. And if you are wanting to anonymize it, then you have to reduce the delta presence, which is its identifiable, the risk of re-identification, to 0. And that would be fully anonymized data. So delta presence at 1 is very easily identifiable. Delta presence on the right-hand side at 0 is no risk at all. But the sliding gauge, which is the pseudonymization process, or the algorithms that you can use for pseudonymization, will never take you all the way down to 0. It'll get you very close, but it won't take you there. So that's where you're at the very, 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 very blue part, but it will never go to black. So you are better assuming that you are always operating and working with pseudonymized data and complying with GDPR, rather than assuming that you have converted human readable data into anonymized data, and therefore the regulation doesn't apply. One of the issues is that pseudonymized data can always, there is always a risk of it being re-identified or to an individual. And because it's not just through the data itself, but it's through human knowledge, people knowing people. So can we work with other data, join other data sets to identify? So the principle of our solution is to take clients through the pseudonymization process or depersonalization of data sets and reducing the risk to a minimum, so that you can convert personal data into commercially valuable data that can then be transferred to the 180 jurisdictions worldwide in a compliant way.
David, do you envisage this working for some of the clients that we've been working for?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point from Jonathan, because there is no real standard for anonymization, and the sort of guidance generally is a well-informed technical person might be able to de-anonymize it. And I have to admit, for kind of quite a while, when people told me they had anonymized data, I never used to check. And then when I started to check, I wished I'd done it before, because quite often one person's version of what they regard as anonymization, and some of them, you know, I looked at and I thought, my mum could decrypt this and she doesn't understand anything about this. You know, just changing the odd letter here or there, or a bit of a postcode is, you know, especially when some postcodes only have one house, is not really that useful. So absolutely, and I think it's a really good starting point. And I think I'll kind of combine it. I think there's a question in there about the Irish Commissioner mentioned that encryption is not sufficient, since the NSA, you know, apparently can unencrypt it. Guess what? That happens in every country around the world. So, you know, where do you draw the line? The second problem with that is encryption is notoriously difficult to write. You know, I think there's a handful of people who have enough brain power in the world who can actually write encryption. And that's another difficulty. So if you use a version of encryption that hasn't been government verified, you're not really sure how good it is. And the only true test of encryption is how long it's been in the open and how long it hasn't been cracked. So there are some types of encryption that apparently haven't been kind of cracked in the open. So probably the solution is multi-layered encryption from different sources, from different places around the world, and manage the keys to make that person. And then the thing is it worth the effort? I'm not sure at this moment in time.
Jonathan, what do you feel about that?
Well, I think I'll throw in a bit of law on this and take you deeply into the recitals to GDPR. So recital 26 is the one to look out for. And what that essentially says is that if you have pseudonymized data, then you have to accept that you are caught by GDPR. You're within the regulatory framework. But what it then goes on to say is essentially compliance lies in risk assessment. So if you accept the premise that you're never going to arrive at perfection in terms of anonymized data, then you need to have alongside your verification process, or as part of it, an assessment of how long it would take somebody, how long you'd estimate it would take somebody to reverse engineer and get back to individual identification using available technologies at the time of processing. So the more convincing and the more well documented your pseudonymization layers are, the closer you get to the compliant end of the spectrum. And I think there are a range of techniques that can be adopted. Everything from sort of forms of light encryption through to cryptographic hashing, through to techniques like zero knowledge proof. So there's quite an array of techniques that can be used to depersonalize or mask or obscure or de-identify personal data. And it's really a question of being clear about how far along that spectrum you are. And you will never get a lawyer to say, that's great. You will get a lawyer to say, I'm told by a technical expert, that's good. And that can then be documented as part of your essentially sort of disclosure pack, part of your records of processing, to be available should the regulator come calling. And remember, the fundamental point about GDPR and most data laws is it is about intelligent engagement with the problems. It's about every step towards compliance being a worthwhile step. And it's about demonstrating to the regulator that you've taken data subjects' rights seriously. So that's where I think it fits. And that's the avenue, I think, to navigating Schrems. Because as I was saying in a webinar last week, if SCC, standard contract clauses, simply can't be used in the way that Schrems suggested, then you have a clash between the European Union's view of data protection and privacy and the United States government's view of the importance of surveillance. Between a rock and a hard place, GDPR, I think, would be the loser.
I think from some of the things that you've all said, obviously working out where your data is flowing is absolutely critical. And one of the things that we've had a question here is how do companies like Microsoft, Google, etc. handle the judgment? Presumably the need for a representative office in various territories now is becoming even more important than it was. I mean, it was important before, but it's almost critical now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that relates to what one of the earlier questions as well about the possibility of turning the European Union or EU into a sort of a data island. If US businesses in particular decide that the safer course is to localize data within the European Union, then whether they need an Article 27 representative or not depends on whether that localization results in them having an establishment in the EU. If they have an establishment under Article 3.1, they're directly within the reach of the regulator. If they don't have an establishment, but are nonetheless targeting through the offering of goods or services or the monitoring of behavior in the EU, then they would need an Article 27 rep. And that has actually become easier over the last year because EDP guidance has changed so that if there are Article 30 records in place, it is now much more sensible and safer to stand as an Article 27 rep. So I think there's something to be discussed with US side data controllers and processors about altering the architecture and the location of where data is processed. And Article 27 is a key part of that. I noticed incidentally we just had a question in about quantum computing, which I was really hoping would come up because the argument there, I think, is that if quantum computing ever reached scalable fruition, then all cryptography is immediately off the table, and everything is simultaneously a naught and one. And you're into the land of kind of Schrodinger's data protection. If we get to that, and there's a lot of work going on at Oxford University at the moment to accelerate quantum computing, then we have a whole different order of problem.
Fascinating. One of the questions here, I think, sorry, Atanas, it looks as if we may have misinterpreted your question. He said, should we create a data island, an EEA data, European data island, meaning that no third country, which would potentially include the UK after Brexit, get any data from Europe? All processing should happen in Europe. Is that practical?
I'll leave the techies to take that one first.
Okay, David, I'll ask you that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's almost kind of where the kind of strange kind of battleground is, because when data protection probably kind of first came around, it was very, very localized. Generally, data stayed in the country just by default. No one really had much use for anybody else's data on a global basis. That has radically changed now. There's probably no such thing really as kind of local data or sovereignty of data, even if we would like to believe that there is. We are not happy with the US with their surveillance laws. The US are not happy with the Chinese with their surveillance regulations. And guess what we kind of use every day? Every one of us, our phones, our laptops are made probably in China, and all the software that we run, it's very difficult to find anything that's actually made in Europe. So we're actually got a software US layer, hardware Chinese layer, and nobody's happy with each other on a global scale. Is that the point where things need to be kind of a bit more regulated locally? As I said earlier, you talk to the government in the UK, they're using all US based stuff. How do we even complain about this without doing an international transfer? And I noticed on Schrems' own website, I don't know if anyone's kind of looked at it, I'm not sure if this is tongue in cheek, but he has kind of suggested that people can write to a potential data controller and ask them if their data is being transferred internationally. Interesting thing about that, he also adds in that this requires no further verification of my ID. I'm not too sure about that, because, for example, if we're using a personal email, somebody else might have access to it. They might use that to actually confirm that, I can't think of a bad scenario, that maybe I was a member of a club online that I probably shouldn't be, and my wife would kill me. They could send that email. A response could come back and say, yes, we do transfer your data internationally. Thank you. You've now just kind of destroyed my image and reputation by actually confirming that I exist on that database, let alone the international transfer. So many of these things are very, very complex. I'm not sure there's an easy one.
Do you think he's drumming up some supporters for mass DSARs, data subject access requests?
I think everyone kind of supports Max. I don't think there's kind of any doubt about it. I mean, I think he's saying the right things, and they're totally appropriate. It's just, how do we fix this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we've always found with working with clients is, and Athanas says here, it's not a matter of convenience so much, it's a matter of compliance. That is true, and where we try to help clients is finding practical solutions. And with this one, it's a difficult one. I mean, a practical solution, the first stage, as we said before, is working out where your data is actually flowing to and from. And that's quite difficult if you are using things like Microsoft and Google and AWS. How would you suggest that clients actually do try and figure that out? Jonathan, maybe that's one for you.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you can still extract the log files from the cloud servers. So you can either put agents in those log files and all the activities that are taking place within those systems. You can still get the log files and monitor them yourselves within a security operations center environment. So there are definitely providers that can help clients with that. I think from our perspective, I'm going back to the DSARs and the mass DSARs issue. I think that the most important thing really to do is to create an index of your personal data, because to be able to handle them as DSARs, if you have access to the information so you can respond quickly, or even allow self-service, is an even better solution. So from our perspective, a starting point is know your data, index your data and have access to it, and make sure that you're not holding any data that is in fact past the date or is out of date from the retention policy. The second thing that you can also do then, once you have created this index, there are a number of other questions, but apart from being able to answer DSARs quickly, and so the number of DSAR requests that come in wouldn't really matter. But there's also to be able to, you can then go ahead and start to do the anonymization or pseudonymization of those data sets, so that you can work through motivated intruder attacks, which are a sort of an exercise to understand how is this data that I've just, or the pseudonymized data that's just been created, there's a human version to empirically go through and see if there are ways of joining that data. So the key, I think, there is the log files and understanding where data is flowing, but most importantly is knowing what you have. And I think that Malcolm will say that very rarely at a time of breach has a client got an Article 30 record in place. So the first 72 hours or first 60 hours of a 72-hour breach response is actually scrambling around to find out what data we have. Whereas if you have actually indexed and gone through this process, that wouldn't be an issue, and you would be gaining a lot of time and be able to put your strategy for your breach response strategy together and make decisions much quicker. And also the legal team supporting you are not suffering from fatigue.
Yes, that's something that we've actually found on a number of situations where we've been looking at breach response, is the data flow maps are just not complete. So that is something that's absolutely critical for people to do. Malcolm, there was a conversation I was spying on really in LinkedIn a couple of days ago, which was really more to do with how this might threaten the development of the UK-US deal post-Brexit. Do you think it's that important, that significant?
Well, I think it is, because the starting point, and there are two layers to this. One is that, as we've seen with the whole Huawei saga, there is a fairly strong suggestion that the UK government is very, very keen to strike a trade deal with the US, to the extent that it's quite likely to do as much as it can to accede to US government requests and priorities. Now, there is a possibility there that if the UK doesn't essentially find its own parallel equivalent to Privacy Shield, so that the UK-US relationship can continue as it was pre-Schrems, that there may be a bumpy road in terms of those trade negotiations. Problem with that is that we're already in a slightly contentious relationship with the EU in terms of the post-Brexit position. And there are concerns, for example, particularly in Germany, that the UK law, the Investigatory Powers Act, itself gives too much power to governments and intelligence services and agencies for surveillance. So there is a question mark over the speed at which an adequacy decision could be reached in relation to the UK. So the UK is in a slightly invidious position of having to somehow retain its position as a sort of Atlantic bridge without mortally offending either to the continent or the US. That, you know, beyond that, it's above my pay grade by a long way to see how that will turn out.
No, that's helpful. David, have you got any last thoughts on this that will perhaps?
I guess one thing is could this potentially affect how we deliver DSARs? Because by the mere fact we are responding to somebody electronically by email, we could be sending it to an account that is not in the UK and is in the US. Therefore, by the mere fact we respond with information, we are effectively creating yet another international transfer. And where I mean, obviously sending it encrypted via email is obviously the best solution, or even better, a portal. You know, are we actually kind of restricting the way that we can respond?
Well, I think if I can just have a go on that one for you, David, because I think that there's a verification process that you would go through, and you need to establish a sound verification process. So as a DSAR comes in, how do you verify that person? And there are a number of questions you can go through. So can you send me a copy of a recent bill? The typical questions that you would get actually for due diligence when opening a bank account. So it's similar things you are entitled to ask for to verify. Once you're satisfied, you can then respond, but you do have that right to verify.
Absolutely.
And Malcolm, do you have any last thoughts on this whole subject? Do you think it's something that perhaps will go to the next level of court, and will it be appealed?
The Schrems judgment itself won't, and I think it's very much a political question from there. I'm just, if I may, going to take up questions come in about how do we see these stringent requirements playing out in emerging markets such as those in Africa. And the reason I would like to take that question is that we are seeing GDPR-like regimes emerging in Kenya, for example, in Nigeria with NDPR, in Dubai with the IFC, in India. And all of those regimes have taken GDPR as their model. And I guess that does give us a little bit of an avenue of optimism, in that when it comes to things like international transfers and the verification layers that we've been discussing, it does open up the possibility of EU data regulators being able to arrive at accommodation with, for example, the data commissioner in Kenya, as to practically how this situation can be addressed. So I think that avenue of regulator to regulator engagement and business to business engagement is going to be the driver of a practical outcome. And I should really emphasize that, going back to the earlier comment about compliance or convenience, unlike computer code, I would emphasize that GDPR compliance is not binary. It is much more of a kind of a spectrum. It is a question of how can you demonstrate to the regulator that you have taken seriously data subject rights, and that you have taken step by step by step measures to protect those data subject rights. I think it suitably recognizes that perfection is unattainable, but intelligent engagement is not.
So it comes back down again to the things we're always saying is evidence, 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 and make sure your record of processing is up to date.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much, all of you. I think we've probably answered most of the questions we've had here today. A recording of this video webinar will be available on the ADPP website. ADPP is a network that we've actually established a while ago now, which is really a peer-to-peer community for anybody working in the data protection and cybersecurity world. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, we'd be delighted to hear from you. We'll be doing this webinar again next week for a US audience, and we may well revisit this whole subject as things become a little bit clearer over the course of the next few months. But thank you very much, Malcolm. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, David. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Thanks, Penny.
Thank you.
Thanks.